Are you tired of choosing bosses with rivers of blood? Does Kamita's lore make the game boring for you to play? Do you want to try out a really strong yet engaging build for your character in Elden Ring? Well, if the answer to at least one of those questions is yes, then you've clicked on the right video. With the DLC for Elden Ring on the horizon, many players are gonna be coming back to revisit this masterpiece. And if you're one of those players, then this video will serve as a guide for you. And for people who play Elden Ring often, this video will highlight some builds that you might want to try out. So this time around, I will cover arcane, intelligence, and faith-based builds. If you happen to like what you're watching, do drop a like and a sub. This will greatly help the channel and make my day just a smidge happier. So without further ado, let's get to it. So, I want to start out with a bang. Literally, the pure Pyromancer build is my favorite build in the entire game. It's just so much fun. This build is my go-to method of choosing Malenia, when I feel like it of course, as it does have some of the most damaging incantations in the entire game. The main damage source for this build is going to be Catch Flame. For such an entry-level spell, it's amazing to me that it deals so much damage, even late game. After quite a bit of testing, I decided upon this stat spread for a level 138 character, which I would consider the baseline level with which most people finish the game with, and is the latest level that you can use in PvP for level 125 invasions. The passive damage tool is going to be the Flame of the Fell God incantation, which you can cast at the start of the fight, and the ball of fire will slowly drift towards an enemy and explode on impact. This can be chained together with Giant's Flame Take the incantation for a massive burst of damage. The final tool that this build has access to is Burn or Flame, an incredible tool that you can use if you are in a cheeky mood and if you're having trouble with a certain boss. Malenia and pretty much any boss that doesn't do attacks that are directed to the ground gets absolutely melted by it. So as for the talismans, Faithful's Canvas and Flock's Canvas talismans give an overall 12% damage increase for all incantations, the Fire Scorpion Charm gives a 12% damage increase for fire-based attacks, and finally Godfrey's Icon Talisman for the bonus 15% damage for charged spells. The Physic tier setup is quite simple: Flame Shrouding tier and the Faith Knot tier. To cast my incantations, I'm using the Erdtree seal, and in my offhand I'm using the Giant's Flame seal for a passive boost to all of the Giant's Flame incantations, of which there are 3: Flame of the Fell God, Giant's Flame Take Thee, and Burn of Flame. The armor of choice for this build is the Tree Sentinel armor and greaves, Royal Knight's helmet, and the Beast Champion gauntlets. For another example of how a typical fight with this build would go down, here's the Godfrey boss fight. So, I drink the Physic, use the Golden Vow incantation, I then use Flame Grant Me Strength, and I go in. Moving on to another personal favorite of mine, the Carrion Spellblade build. So this build revolves around summoned swords of pretty much all types. The stat spread is pretty simple, here it is. Along with these spells you can also use, well, pretty much any other spell of your choosing, but personally, I like using thematic builds, obviously. So a spellcaster who specializes in summoning swords is a really fun build in my book. The most damaging tool that this build has access to is the Carrion Grandeur Ash of War. This thing is just sweet. When fully charged, it does absolutely mental amounts of damage to both health and poise, giving you an opportunity to stance break a boss after 3 hits. To take it a step further, I'm also using a magic Misericord dagger, which deals extra damage when riposting an enemy. For a passive source of damage, I'm using the Glintblade Phalanx Ash of War, which also prevents bosses from regaining their poise. Another great tool to use is the Carrion Slicer. This thing deals moderate amounts of damage but can be cast very quickly, allowing you to melt bosses.
Carrion Piercer is a great all-around tool to use for PvP, but it also has its moments in PvE, specifically against invaders, who you can more or less stun lock with this thing. And last but not least is Adula's Moonblade, with which you are probably familiar with. It does great damage, and on top of that it builds up frostbite with each hit and with each projectile it launches. Moving on to the armor. Now this is quite important. I'm using the Spellblade armor obtained from the corpse of Sorcerer Rogier in the Round Table Hold. Each piece of armor gives a 2% bonus to sorceries, with an overall 8% boost to this build's damage output. Now as for the talismans, I am rocking the Graven Mass and Skull talismans, which give an overall 12% boost to sorceries, the Magic Scorpion Charm for another 12% damage increase for sorceries, and to counteract the negative side effects of the Magic Scorpion Charm, I am also using the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for a 17% damage negation bonus. For my physic tier, I chose the Magic Shrouding tier and the damage negation tier. So a usual boss fight would go down like this. I drink the physic flask, cast Carrion Phalanx, and go in.
And finally, we have the Mariah's Executioner Sword build, or more specifically the Eochaid's Dancing Blade Ash of War build. That's a mouthful. I don't see this build as often as some other builds, which is kind of odd, as this is one of those builds that packs quite a punch, and is one of the most damaging builds that exist in the game. The Ash of War shreds through enemies, and overall, this weapon itself deals a decent amount of damage, and has a good moveset, sharing it with most of the other great swords. After quite a bit of testing, I decided upon this stat spread for a level 138 character. The main stats are obviously going to be arcane and strength, with other stats being up to you to decide. I am wearing quite a heavy armor set, but if you want, you can always choose something lighter and allocate the endurance points elsewhere. The talismans that I am using for this build are the Winged Sword Insignia. If you have a Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, do swap to that talisman as it is a straight up upgrade, but for the sake of restricting this build to the first playthrough, I am going to go with the baseline talisman. Millicent's Prosthesis gives us pretty much the same buff, but also adds 5 extra levels into dexterity on top of that, which helps with getting the stat requirements for the weapon. But if you decide to use something else, you would need to invest some points into dexterity. The third talisman is the Shard of Alexander, which gives a 15% boost to all Ashes of War with no downside. And the fourth talisman slot is quite flexible, you can use whatever you feel like. If you need more health, use the Amber Medallion. For more defense, you can use the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. But I prefer to use Godfrey's Icon Talisman, which gives yet another 15% boost to the Ash of War, but only when it's fully charged. It also gives this boost to fully charged sorceries and incantations, which we are not using. For the first source of buffs, the Physic Flask, I am using the Magic tier and the Horny tier. Sorry, I used that for my IRL build. Anyway, for the in-game build, I use the Magic tier and the Thorny Crack tier. The former adds a straight up buff to the Ash of War, and the latter acts in a similar manner to the Winged Sword Insignia. The other two buffs that I am using are the Golden Vow Ash of War and Flame Grant Me Strength. So a typical boss battle would go down like this. I drink the Physic for boosts that last 3 minutes, then I use Golden Vow which lasts for 80 seconds, giving an 11% damage increase and a 7% damage negation boost. And finally, I use Flame Granting Strength to boost the physical damage by 20%. All of the talismans and buffs feed into the Ash of War incredibly well, giving it just an enormous damage boost.
Oh, and for the early game version of the Mariah's Executioner's Sword, you can get the Regalia of Eochaid located right here. It's a straight sword that has the same Ash of War as the Mariah's Executioner's Sword, but it is just slightly weaker. So, if you don't have a specific item, feel free to look for the rest of the video to find a particular talisman or spell.
If you are wise, you will leave immediately.
Oh, a pleasure to see you. A pleasure indeed. pleasure to see you.